we developed a wonderful relationship. Meant a great deal to me. And in addition to his humor, though, he surely would share with me some wonderful truths and would give me some insights.
I hope you know that voice. It's Dr. Jerry Vines, of FBC Jacksonville. Legendary pastor, architect of one of the nation's preeminent expository preaching conferences. In the months after my grandfather passed away, Jerry sent me a note that said simply, "Your grandfather changed my preaching." It was so intriguing that I had to have a conversation with him and learn what I could about the call of God on his life and glean wisdom from him about the work of preaching. Our conversation gets into the weeds of pastoral leadership and teamwork. And Jerry offers me a great perspective on being a pastor and a father. More than anything, Jerry is so easy to talk to. I got the impression that he's always been genuinely interested in others. And after this conversation, I think you're going to think he's interested in you too, teaching the Bible with authority. Here's my conversation today with Dr. Jerry Vines. Dr. Jerry Vines, thanks for taking a little bit of time today to talk to us about preaching, Warren Wiersbe, and your ministry.
Well, thank you, Dan, and I'm excited that you are giving me this opportunity.
Yeah, you're coming to this conversation from where? You're in Georgia?
Yes, when I retired from First Baptist of Jacksonville, we built a house and moved back up here. My wife and I are both from Georgia, and also, we're close to the Atlanta airport, so you can go anywhere in the world from there. So about
Yeah.
17 years ago, we made that transition.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a moment. I know you because my grandfather used to rave about the pastors conference that you put on at First Baptist Church, the First Baptist Church's pastors conference. And I'd love to know, you met Warren. Is that where you met Warren Wiersbe?
No, actually, Dan, I met him many years before that. I guess I've been trying to pinpoint it exactly, but I would say it was in the 1970s
Oh, wow.
when I first met your granddad. And I actually heard him at a Bible conference at Highland Park Baptist Church in Chattanooga, Tennessee Temple, a
Yeah.
university there. And I had never heard him. And I just, went up there to their Bible conference. I walked in one morning about 8 o'clock, and there were 4,000 plus people there. And I had to run to catch a folding chair in the aisle. And then your granddad got up, and I finished, majored in Bible in college, and then had a seminary degree. And I'm not saying they didn't teach it, but I just never heard any kind of Bible teaching like your granddad was doing. And I kept thinking, well, where's he getting this? And I'd look at my Bible and I'd say, well, there it is, right there. So I mean, he was doing a method of preaching, which you and I know now is expository preaching, but I had just not been trained in that direction, and so it was just absolutely overwhelming to me.
Hmm.
And he gave me a deep desire to become that kind of preacher. And so I totally changed my preaching at that point in time as a result of your father, grandfather.
Give us a little context on how old you are at this moment. I mean, when you and I talked before we hit the record button, you had said that exact phrase, it really helped change some of your preaching. How long had you been preaching before that? And what was the shift like?
Well, I actually had my first church when I was 18. And so I presume by the 70s, I guess I was what, in my 30s or something like that. And so, and I'm 85 now, be 86, God willing, in September.
Yeah.
So I've been
Way to go.
around a while.
So still the boy preacher inside you somewhere, right? I mean, 18 years old, that is young.
Yeah, that is pretty young. I was actually in college at the time, and when I had my first church, and so, but I had preached probably, a number of years before I heard your grandfather, and it was kind of topical, and it was a misery. It was an ordeal trying to find passage of scripture every week,
Yeah.
just jumping all over the Bible, which you can do it that way, but it certainly is better to take books of the Bible and go through them consecutively. That's been my experience.
Was that one of the big changes for you at the Tennessee Temple Bible Conference? Was just saying, hey, I could just walk through the text and let the text provide the interest and the need and the reason for the message, as opposed to some sort of cultural moment or some Christian idea of formation that you wanted to give to people?
Yes, that's exactly right. And when I first heard your grandfather, it showed me that I could do that, and then so I started preaching through books of the Bible, and it was an adjustment for me, of course, and it was an adjustment for my congregation. They'd not heard that before, but as you, I'm sure, know, once you get people attuned to that method of preaching, nothing else will ever satisfy them, and that's what they want to hear. And so it was life changing for me and for my people, I believe.
How I wanted to go back in the calling of God on your life to preach. Would you bring us back to whenever that moment was that you started at 18, so I imagine it was rather young. When did you have this sense of wanting to invest your life in sharing God's word?
Yeah, I was 16. I was a senior in high school, and I came to Christ as a 9-year-old boy. And but unfortunately, up until 16, I really didn't grow and mature the way I should have as a Christian. But at 16, God really began to deal with my heart, my life, and so I just had an overwhelming sense that He wanted me to preach. I didn't have any preachers in my family, with the exception of a grandfather who late in life became kind of a country preacher, evangelist around, never had a church. But that was just not my heritage like yours is. I just didn't have that in our background. But there's just an overwhelming sense that this is what God wanted me to do. So I surrendered to the Lord to do it. I told my pastor about it. It shocked him. He said I was the most unlikely boy in town to be called to preach. I was something more of a rebel rouser than anything else, I guess.
Do
But I
you,
announced.
sorry to
Go ahead.
interrupt you, but do you remember how that sat with you? Because here you are, 60 some years later, remembering
Mhm.
that. Was
Yeah.
that a bit of a challenge? Was that a bit of a humbling moment? How did you receive that?
Well, when I told him that I had been called to preach, his remark was, "Oh no." I mean, literally, that's what he said. "Oh no." And he never had me to preach in those years. He was afraid of what I might do
Sure.
when I
Yeah,
got in
sure.
the pulpit. But I wasn't offended by it because I agreed. I didn't know what I was going to do either. But then, I went on to college to prepare myself to study for the ministry, as I said, then Mercy University in Macon, Georgia, and then I went on to New Orleans Baptist Seminary, one of our Southern Baptist schools. So, but I understood where he was coming from.
They say humility is having a sound assessment of yourself, right? Not thinking too high or too low. And it sounds like
Yeah.
you're cloaked with humility in that
Well,
moment.
yeah, I'm yeah, I tell people, that I won the humility badge one time, but they took it away from me when I wore it. So I don't I may have gotten that from your grandfather.
That sounds just
He
like him.
oh, I'm telling you, he had a wit like
Yeah.
few men I've ever known. I'm sure you know that better than I do.
Yeah. Well, we had heard he had a rolling repertoire, kind of like a music box, just plays the same sound over and over on a loop. We kind of knew what was coming next. My mom would sit at the table with him and mouth the words along, and my grandma would laugh before the punchline was ever delivered.
Miss
So
Betty.
yeah, Betty, yeah, that's right. I could see her chuckling, sitting at the table, just knowing what was coming. Hey, I love that you were early in ministry, preaching as a young man. What were some of the early lessons you learned in your preaching that that you still kept with you? I think sometimes we think it's going to fall away, whatever our early days were, but are there some lessons that you started off with as an 18, 19 into your 20s that really served you well to pastor well?
Well, I think one of the things that I learned is that we're totally dependent on the Lord for our messages, though we may have certain methods and approaches to study and all of that. But the fact of the matter is, the Lord has to really birth the message in your heart. And I think I learned that early on. My first church, we had about 40 people, I think it was. We had fabulous growth. We grew to 80. And so, but I remember quite well. And I was, like I said in the early years, I was jumping here and there and here and there. And I came, to a point, I had been a youth speaker kind of around, and I had, several messages like that. But then when I ran through them, I didn't have anything. And I had to learn to go to the Lord and for him to help me. And so I try to this day not to prepare or get ready to preach without asking for the Holy Spirit to fill me and to take control of my life. So that has served me from those first years right on to the end here.
Walk us through some of the ways God used you. You pastored in Georgia and Alabama, but you also had this stint where many people know your name is really from your days at First Baptist Church in Jacksonville. Do I have the story right? You had decided to jump into that ministry as a co-pastor. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Homer Lindsey Jr. Actually, the church had a history of that because his father, Homer Lindsey Sr., brought Junior there as co-pastor, and the term there is truly co in every way. There was no number one, number two, so to speak, but we were both we were both pastors, but when we were referencing one another, we used the term co-pastor. But the church already had that experience, and so it was just a natural transition. And I went, he and I prayed about it for a couple of years, and then I went there in 1982, I believe it was, and stayed until 2006, which was almost 24 years.
That is fascinating for me. One of the things I haven't shared with you, but I am a co-pastor right now in my context here in Kansas. I don't co-pastor with one other person. I co-pastor with two other men. We call it our lead team. And here's what I found. We just transitioned the church from a senior pastor model to this 3-person lead team, co-equal lead pastors. I primarily champion the teaching. We've got a wonderful pastor who champions our discipleship pathways and content to help people grow. We've got another pastor who's really wise, who's got a great handle on how our organization from the legal side of things and all, maybe traditionally would be called an executive pastor. Here's what I found out is that many people today don't think that 3 people or 2 people can lead a church together without there being friction and tension and chaos. And we're 18 months into this experiment out here in Kansas, and it's going incredibly well. But I'm curious if you hit any resistance as well, or did the established co-pastor reality at First Baptist Church already pave the way for you just to come in? And I'd love to hear some more. I mean, this is a bit of I don't know if anyone that's going to be listening, they're going to tune out for a couple of seconds because I'm really keyed into what you have to say. How did that experience go working with another man and leading the church together? What were some of the positives? Maybe what were some of the challenges?
Well, I suppose during those years I had 50 pastors contact me and tell me that they were considering a co-pastor model. And quite frankly, I basically told almost all of them I wouldn't encourage you to do that. Because I don't, think honestly, it's a model that's going to work in most places and with most pastors. Most of us have an abundance of ego, and we like the limelight. And so the question is, let's face it, there's some people, at your church, they say, well, Brother Dan's my guy. I like him. I don't care for this one over here too good. And then the other one said, well, I don't care for him, but I like Dan.
Yeah,
I'm of Apollos, I'm of Paul.
exactly.
But we had two services for a long, long time. That first Jacksonville, and I did one, and Dr. Lindsay did the other, and then I did the Sunday night. He did the Wednesday night. And I used to tell people, well, if you've got one pastor, if the people get mad at you, they leave and go to another church. In our place, if they get mad, they change services. So, but it's not a model because there are many factors. The reason it worked well for me and Dr. Lindsay is that both of us, number one, had the same goal. We wanted to win people to Christ and help people to grow in the Lord. Number two, that although I've said already, we preachers have an abundance of ego, but both of us, I don't think we're really, we just didn't have to have the limelight. I didn't, and he didn't. And we had an agreement that if there was any major decision that needed to be made, we met about it. And I recognized the fact that he had been there many more years than I had been, and there were some instances where I would say to him, "Well, I think you know better about this. I'll go with you. Let's see how this will happen." There were other times when he would say, "Well, let's go with you on this one. I think that." And there were times that he would want to do something I didn't care to do, but I'd say, "Okay, let's do it," and it wouldn't work, and I'd say, "I told you so," and then vice versa. We agreed that we would always, even if we disagreed, we would come to some resolution. And when we walked out of the room together, that was never known. People never knew. We always came out united in those kinds of things. So, I don't think it's going to work in a lot of places. That is, what you're doing right now is a model that has become more and more current today than it has in previous years. Did the church start that way, or was it a denominational church? And
No, our church has started with two very capable, charismatic, and by all means of spiritual fruit, successful senior pastors, and really just reached a very large segment of the Kansas side of Kansas City. And just in the sense of seeing a lot of the challenges across the scope of evangelicalism, decided one of the safeguards that could be put in place for the church in the future was having a multiple mutual team leadership model. We found, not to keep belaboring this point, but we found that it does slow down some of the movement of the church, but it's generated longer momentum. So some of the quick activity or the frenetic activity of a body is really not present for us, but some of the deep coals that fuel the fire of what God uses to build a church, we're finding a lot of strength in the model that way. Hey, I want to ask you about so you brought up, you're a Baptist preacher. You're really highly connected in the Baptist world, the Southern Baptist world, Baptist pastors, president, and then the president of the convention for a couple of years. I think you did two sessions, and would love to know, you was that in the late 80s was when you were there?
Yes, I was elected in 1988. And then I served in 89. I was reelected and I served in 90. So actually my 2 years were 89 and 90.
So I imagine that's, I'm watching the Baptist presidents these days, and it seems like to pastor a church and be a president of the denomination and have a family and have multiple speaking opportunities, and it's kind of like the pastoring or preaching and thing. What were some of the ways that you found it just possible for you to carry out all the ministry requirements that were in front of you at the church, as well as give leadership to the broader denomination? I'm sure that must have been a struggle. And
at this stage of my life, I'm totally disconnected from Southern Baptist life. I feel like that I served my time, and now it's time for others. And so I don't involve myself in any way with Southern Baptist life. I'm totally separated from it. One advantage, though, I had is that I did have a co-pastor, and he was always there on the premises, so to speak. When I was president of the convention, come Monday, I was on a plane going somewhere, and I did a whole lot of sermon preparation on airplanes.
Mm.
And but I did have this policy. I did not miss on Sunday because of Southern Baptist purposes, except two times. Well, 2 Sundays out of the year, the Sunday before and the Sunday after the SBC, and then I'd take a 2-week Sunday vacations. So, I was there for the most part. And then when I was not there, he kind of held the fort for us. So, but it's a challenge. I will tell you that but I tried to make family even so a priority. My youngest son played football at Liberty University, and in the 2 years that I was president, he was playing ball up there, and played 21 games. I saw 19 of them. I was there for 19 of those games. I had to move heaven and earth, private airplanes, all kinds of things, but I made it a priority to be there. And I tried to use the same priority with my other children, too. But it's a balancing act. You've got a lot of balls in the air, and the Lord just has to help you do it,
There's a couple of people who are in it right now listening to this, pastors who have kids in college, pastors who have kids whose lives are just needing attention. Looking back, you hinted at some of the costs that it took for you to make sure you were present. Worth it?
To be the president?
No, to do all of it and to make sure your family was connected, and to, that sounds like a tremendous expenditure of energy and a real dedication.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It is worth it. I had my study at home. I don't know how you do, but I do my library and everything is at home. And but it was always any of my children at any point at any time could come in. They were never excluded. They could come in at any time, and whatever I was doing, I'd stop and give them the attention that they needed. So you're going to minister everybody else's children and then lose your own. That's not a good thing. And so I think you need to make every effort. My priorities were Jesus, my family, and my church. That's kind of the way I operated in the thing. Then my wife did a marvelous job, of course, but I went to all of their activities. I mean, through the ball playing years, the piano recitals, I was there. Father's, Mother's Days at schools, we were there. And so I think it's very important for a pastor to make that a priority, and especially those young ones like you have.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. It's really wise. I'd love to just ask some questions about your days at Jacksonville. The pastors conference, was that started by you, or was that something that was already going?
No, it was actually something I started. Let me kind of update you too, to show you how it came about. My grandfather back there, as I say, I tuned into him. And so at some point, I developed a relationship with him. I got to know him. And then I had him speak in different things. But when we got to the First Jax Pastors Conference, well, actually before that, when I was president of the Southern Baptist Convention Pastors Conference, I had your father to come and speak. Mm-hmm. And I had, among others, Stephen Olford. You know that name. And by the way, it's kind of funny now, but I drew a good bit of criticism on my program for having non-Southern Baptist on it. your grandfather being one of them,
That
and
was
all
a
for being,
yeah, yeah.
you know, that was kind of the mentality, I guess. But I felt like Southern Baptists needed to hear these men here, and I don't know that I'm the one, but I think probably I was pretty soon, if not the first Southern Baptist to use your granddad.
Hmm.
But I did that there at that conference, and then our conference in Jacksonville. We started off with I think our first year we had 120. The last year, my last year there, and the conference went on a few years after I was there, but 2006, that last night there were 14,000 plus, they say, showed up, and we had overflow rooms and everything else. But I started, what I would have, I tried to have a mix of preachers, pastors, evangelists, and Bible teachers. And I had my Bible teachers in the morning, and my two that I really had every year were Wiersbe and John Phillips.
Yeah.
And that was my two Bible teachers. And of course, your dad, then we built that big building there, which has been sold since. But
is it no longer part of FBC?
That building has been sold.
Got it.
They've gone back to another building there.
Okay.
But your grandfather, I will never forget the first time he spoke in that new building. They say it seated 10,000. I think probably closer to 8,000.
Yeah, and who's counting at that point, right?
Oh, yeah. And he got up and he looked around at the building. He said to go from one side of this building to the other, you got to go through 3 time zones, which is typical, isn't it? And that's something your granddad would say.
Yeah,
and
that's exactly right.
But we had great fellowship, and we always had a little gathering place for the speakers, and we'd fellowship before the services, after the services, these kind of things. And it was hilarious at times. And your granddad and Phillips were great friends, but whatever view one of them would take, the other one would take the opposite view.
They pit each other against each other.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And you could see him. Yeah. Back. It was just all, but it was really fun to watch it, and to see that kind of stuff go on. So then I had him every year until I left, I presume, or maybe his health or something. I don't remember exactly, but we developed, and then I would call him many times, and we developed a wonderful relationship. Meant a great deal to me, and in addition to his humor, though, he surely would share with me some wonderful truths and would give me some insights.
Did he ever give you a sermon series you needed to preach? I mean, this was a consistent thing that he'd always say. Have you ever thought about doing a series on this?
Yeah. He would do stuff like that. And of course, one of his first questions to me was, "What are you preaching?"
Right. Every time.
And then the second thing is, "What are you writing?"
Exactly.
Is that what he did to you?
No, he never did it to me, because I don't think he thought much of anyone besides himself in the family being the preacher or the writer, which is not a criticism, but I just don't think he wanted us to have lives, because he was cooped up in his happy place, his office. And you brought up the buildings and FBC's, I call it the district. Like my only experience with that district of Jacksonville is driving through and seeing parking garage after parking garage after parking garage. But what I want to say about all that, why I bring it up, is because I've heard much of your preaching, not all of it, but I've heard much of it. And I get the sense that you are not impressed with the crowds. I don't know if you've ever thought about that or acknowledge that about yourself. When I hear you preach, you are so personable to where a specific person might be. It's almost as if you're speaking to this type of person, or maybe someone here is thinking about coming to Jesus, or maybe you've almost come to Jesus. I would love for you to do that today. Or, you've got such a personal approach to you. Is that something you've always had in your ministry?
That's interesting that you would say that. I don't know that I have consciously done that through the years. I'm glad to hear you say that. I mean, I'm glad that that's the way it came over. Now, one of the things I did try to do is in the preparation of my message, I would think in terms of imaginary people. Or
Yeah.
here's a young person said, how would this, how would I say it to this one? Here's an elderly person with cancer, you know, and so I don't know, maybe that visualization, I guess you'd call it, maybe that impacted me when I did stand to preach. And I'm flattered that you've heard me preach, any. uh I hope you're not like my wife. We figured out one time that she'd heard over 7,000 of my sermons. And so from time to time, after I started doing this, I'd say, would you like to go to the services with me? And she said, I've heard you preach. Just kidding, but I'm impressed. I don't know where you've heard my messages really, but I
Well, they're
thank you
out
for
there. I hope people will tune in and listen to them for sure. I know you're still carrying a couple engagements these days. Is that right? Every now and then.
Oh yeah, I keep a pretty full schedule. I've got probably the best schedule this year I've had in
That's
the
amazing.
17 years. Yeah, it is, and I'm very very thankful for it. And I have many invitations, and I'm grateful for that. And so I'm still going.
Yeah, and don't stop, please. I would love to. You're at Jacksonville. You guys built this really incredible HD. I think you were one of the first preachers in America to really go all in on HD back in the early 2000s. Were you on TV? Were you guys broadcasting in the Jacksonville area? Was it national? What was that like?
Yeah, no, we were in the Jacksonville area. We had some cable networks around that picked us up, but we actually, for a long period of time there, we had two live services on Sunday morning. Both of our morning services were on TV, and of course that impacted how you preached. For instance, at the 11 o'clock or whatever time it was, you could preach as long as you wanted to, but at 11:58 you were going off the air.
Hmm.
And so that kind of helped. That taught me kind of how to confine my message and make it fit. And I think that has pretty well served me since that time. Is learning how you. One of my tendencies has been to just go overboard and just go on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
But
So
the television helped me.
let me ask you about that. My grandfather used a different medium. He was on the radio with Back to the Bible.
Radio.
Was his
Right.
primary medium. He had 14 minutes
Mm-hmm.
for a long a long sermon. He
Mm-hmm.
said, I remember him doing this motion with his hand. He's drawing a circle in the air up by his mind. And he goes, too many preachers just circle, 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 and they never land.
Never.
He
I've
goes,
heard him
he
say
goes, I
that.
wish every preacher would have the experience of preaching on the radio because you don't have the luxury of staying in the air. You got to
That's
land
right.
the plane. And it
That's
sounds
right.
like the restraints of TV helped you with that as well.
Right.
Say more about that. I'm a young pastor. I've got a production team behind me. I'm not on the air, but I'm on a live stream, and we don't have the restraints that you do. But I've put myself on a word count. 2,450 words each message is all I get, and that's because I will keep circling. Was there power in that? You're talking about it as if you enjoyed that experience. I think a lot of preachers think they would dread that experience.
Well, I remember too. Your granddad had a program. What's the good word?
Yeah.
For a number of years,
Yeah.
and I used to listen to that also. So it may be unconsciously that I learned some things, from that as well. But I've never heard people complain about not many people complain about a sermon being too short. Uh, I have heard people complain about being a little lengthy.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the funniest things that happened to me is one Sunday I preached a little bit long, and one of the members came out and said, "Pastor, that'd make a great series." And so, so
You got the
but
message.
yeah, it was really helpful to me. I guess you'd call it structure. Now, say you've got all these technical tools. You said how many words and all of that. Say, I have no clue how many words I have in a message, but you've got access to every bit of that, don't you? Now, do you use notes or do you preach without notes? How do you do that?
I'd love to ask you the same question, but when I have a bit more time in my schedule, I preach without notes. And it makes one of my co-lead pastors really nervous because he feels anxious for me. But I prefer that. If the word is deep in my heart, I can explain it better to people who I'm looking in their face in that moment than I can whatever I imagine they would be thinking when I wrote it. But I'm a manuscript preacher. I'll write out the whole thing. I'll write out my side comments, even my parenthetical comments. I like to imagine myself delivering it as I write so that it's my grandpa, everybody says it, but I learned from my grandpa. It was preach for the ear or write for the ear, not for the eye. And it's a different discipline when you're preaching. You're not writing a book, you're giving a sermon. And so I will write it all out and hopefully see where I'm at so that I can respect people's time. There are some weeks where the demands of ministry for me really, this is a week for me, quite honestly. I know where I'm going with the message, but I've still got about 600 words to write. We're recording this on a Friday. I'm going to preach on this message on Sunday, and I'll probably bring the notes into the pulpit, and my people don't care. They want to hear from God. They don't care if it's with notes or not. What did you do?
Well, I think I'll tell you a kind of a funny story, and but let me preface it by saying I think it would be a good thing to learn how to do it both ways. And I will explain that here in just a moment. But when I first started preaching in my first little church there, the man who was the director of missions, that is, in our Southern Baptist life, kind of helped work with the churches in our area, our association, we called it. He was a member of my church there, fine, wonderful man, great friend. And so one day he said to me, he said, "Preacher," he said, I was 18. He said, have you ever thought about preaching without notes? And I said, well, no, I don't know that I could do that. And he said, I visit all these churches in our association. And he said, the number one criticism I hear from the members is that the pastor uses notes. And he said, you use notes, said, you got a whole bunch of them. And he said, really, you kind of remind me of a chicken drinking water.
The head bob up and down, up and down.
I got the message. So he said, you're young. Said, while your mind is young and keen, why don't you develop preaching without notes so you can maintain that eye contact, as you have indicated earlier on? So at 18, that's what I started doing with fear and trepidation. But I found out along the way, like you've said earlier too, if the message becomes real in your heart, I have said that good impression helps good expression. And so if you've got it in you, if you internalize it, it's easier then to deliver it. But having said all of that, now when I'm at my age now, my memory's not as keen. And I don't remember things as well. So there would be some advantage to me now to use notes in certain situations, but I can't do it. See, I'm so geared in the other direction that I can't even handle notes.
Is that right?
At all. Yeah. And so I would encourage, young guys, learn to do it both ways.
There's this story. It's a bit of a legendary story that I heard. This is going to be a weird name drop, but James McDonald, I worked in Harvest Bible Chapels in years past. Sitting down at lunch with him one day, first time I ever met him, he knew who my grandpa was. He had him preach at his church back in the late 90s, 3 services. And he said, the height of preaching was watching Warren Wiersbe come in and preach the first service. I think he preached out of the Psalms with no notes. The second service, he preached out of the book of like Second Chronicles, different message, no notes. The third service was out of Philippians, again, with no notes. And, my grandpa had a photographic memory, so that's kind of the cheat. But also, I think what you're saying is he had also cultivated this lifetime of understanding how to preach a message, just having a simple roadmap to follow. For my grandpa, it was a key word that had that drove. I heard a message from you. I was preparing for this. I heard you do this exact thing. You said there are 3 people in this text, and that sort of framed for me as a listener. Oh, you're going to talk about these 3 people. And as you do that, you don't need all the notes to remind you. You just need to remember, where am I with the people? Hey, I got one preaching question that kind of it's interesting for me. I don't know if there's a thing here or not, but I'd love to know. Do you preach from a specific version of the Bible?
Yes, I preach from the King James version, and I hasten to say though that I am not a King James only.
Well, yeah. What is it for you? Is it a comfort thing? Is it a historical thing? Is it a
well? I preach for two reasons from the King James. Reason number one is that's the version I have used my entire ministry. I'm comfortable with it, and so I could use another version, I guess, but I'm just familiar with it.
Yeah.
And then another thing, though, Dr. Ryken up at Wheaton.
Yeah.
I think it was his father who's the English professor, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
He wrote
Leland.
He wrote a book on the King James version, and he was not a King James only either. But he pointed out that there is a beauty and a flow to the King James version that has not been duplicated in any English version, which I would concur. And one of the things I've noticed is that people who quote from Scripture, from the Bible, almost invariably they quote the King James version. Mm-hmm. And so, like I say, I'm not building a case for King James only, but I'm just saying there is a literary factor in all of that as well. And I guess it would be helpful for a pastor at a church to settle in a version and encourage his people to have that same version. Do you do that? I mean, do you ask your people to have the same version you do, or?
No, I don't. I'm so grateful for your response. Thank you for explaining that. That was my hunch, was that there was a prose and a poeticism and a familiarity that touches upon the sort of the nostalgia of our souls. And so I thought that was maybe a strategic move, because I've heard you also say, now this word here, if you look it up in a different translation, it's going to say this.
Yes.
And so I appreciate your accessibility and all that. I actually teach from the New International Version, and I like the 1984 edition because that's what I grew up on. That's my nostalgic, what I memorized. But I preach from the 2011 version because that's when people Google the Bible. Well, that's how people are interacting with the Bible these days. If I tell them turn to, they're flipping open their phone and they're opening Google, and they're going to flip open to, and usually the NIV is pretty highly up there. My Moody Bible Institute roots bring me back to the New Living Translation. My grandfather, his first study Bible was called the Transformation Study Bible, has a lot of his notes at the bottom. It was NLT. Currently, his Thomas Nelson has the Wiersbe Study Bible. I believe that's King James version. And so I just find such a rich variety, helps me understand the Bible in some ways that commentaries don't. But it was such a pronounced part of your sermons. I just had to ask. And
now your grandfather, did he use the King James in his teaching, or how did?
Oh yeah. Uh-huh. And sometimes,
but that was early on.
No, almost always.
Okay.
I might be overstating that. I really actually am not sure. I should ask some of my family members. The messages that we're putting on this podcast are coming out. You can hear him preaching from the King James version. Sometimes he struggles with it. There's some words there that are difficult, but he,
Hmm.
if you looked in his study, there was maybe 25 to 30 Bibles on his shelf. And they went all the way from the RSV, King James Version, the RSV, all the way through the Message. And so he spanned quite a spectrum with his study and with his personal study.
Yeah. Have you seen the Christian Standard Bible?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
The adaptation of the Holman Christian. Yeah.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, one of my sons in the ministry was the general editor of that version, and I read that a great deal. I guess out of loyalty to him or something. But I found that's helpful. The only thing that bothers me about some of the newer translations is they eliminate some of the rhetorical devices. Some of the beautiful word pictures and the metaphors and the similes that are in Scripture, and some of the newer translations just completely wipe that out. And I think there's something that is lost. One of your grandfather's books, I guess my favorite book, actually, I probably have read it at least 4 times, is his book on imagination.
Teaching and Preaching with Imagination.
Oh, that's the best book anyone could ever read on looking for the rhetorical devices in Scripture and using those in an imaginative and creative way.
Fair warning, that's going to be the clip that opens up this message or this podcast, and we're just going to stop it at, that's the best book anybody could ever read.
That's right.
I've heard that before, and I have myself skimmed it. I haven't actually dove into it, but that's one of the prayers that he would tell us he'd pray often over his preparation. God, refresh my creativity, refresh my imagination as I come to your word today. Help me to see something new and to be able to teach this imaginatively. Thinking about my message this weekend, I would have saved myself a ton of study had I just gone right to the King James Version, because it pulls out the rhetorical devices that I had to dig through commentaries to find out. So I think you're onto something there. Hey, this has been a really great conversation, Dr. Vines. I would love to ask, just, this is a bunch of young pastors preaching today, and if you could say one thing to current pastors, maybe even young pastors, that would just encourage them, what would be your encouragement?
Well, my number one encouragement to a pastor is that the number one discipline they need is a daily devotional time, beginning the day with the Lord. As you know, when we read the Bible, God is talking to us. When we pray, we're talking to God. And I go to Elijah. You remember Elijah, 1 Kings 17 and 18. 17 says, the Lord said to him, hide thyself. This is King James.
Yeah.
The Lord said to him, hide thyself. Then in chapter 18, the Lord said to him, show thyself. And we're not ready for public ministry until private devotion has taken place. And so we have to hide ourselves off. And I would encourage all young preachers and pastors, maintain that devotional life. That's the source of our power. It's the secret of our strength. It's the guard against temptation. And so whatever they do, take time every morning to begin the day with the Lord.
Well, amen to that. Dr. Vines, thanks for your ministry. Thanks for your generosity and your time today. So good to talk to you. Great to meet you. And I really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure to meet you and to talk with you. It really has.
Likewise, Dr. Vines. Thanks for your time. Man, that was such an honor to chop up ministry with such an enduring pastor. That heart for staying near to Jesus, keeping close to him in prayer. It's the same encouragement Warren Wiersbe kept sharing with our family and with you. Hey, I want to let you know about a quick resource giveaway. This is kind of breaking news. You're hearing this right. As a listener to this podcast, having made it all the way to the end, I want to say thank you to you. For me, it's been really fun to see this podcast community grow in the last year. We're continually reaching new people, and you can help us share trusted biblical preaching by leaving us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. To share our thanks, we're going to give away a limited release copy of the book, In Praise of Plotters. This was recently reprinted solely for a Bible conference, but you can get your hands on an exclusive copy for you and a friend if you simply tweet your favorite quote from this episode, tag at Warren Wiersbe, that's all one word, WarrenWiersbe, and we'll pick a winner on June 30th. Hey, coming up, I've got another incredible interview. I feel so honored to have spent time with one of my own preaching mentors, Dr. H.B. Charles, who is also pastoring in Jacksonville. He hosts his own incredible expository preaching conference called Cutting It Straight. We geeked out on manuscripts, word counts, messages that are memorable. Hey, listen to this sneak peek.
I think a lot of crazy stuff gets said from the pulpit because guys are trying to find, they're reaching for illustration, quote, something relevant, on their feet and not thinking through what they want to say and how they should say it. And I think one of the factors that has contributed to my development as a preacher, that I would commend if I couldn't commend anything else, write yourself clear.
Well, that conversation's coming up in just a few weeks. You know, my grandfather used to say, Dan, all your problems go away when you preach and pray and plug away. Pastors, I hope that you're fulfilling your calling and faithfully preaching God's word. We'll see you next time.